Alright you guys, here's your next Q&A. Like I always say, there was a lot of good questions, and if I did not get you on this one, I will try to get you on the next one. So let me get straight into it. Stephen G wants to know, when you first made the decision you were forced to make, did a small part of you wish you never made those phone calls, took the 100+ years, and stayed in good standing? No, there wasn't a small part of me that wished I never made those phone calls. There was actually a big part of me that wished I never would have made those phone calls and that things would have been different. I can't say I wish I would have got sentenced to the 100 years, but unfortunately, that would have been part of it. It's a difficult situation to put in perspective, and it's difficult to articulate it while sounding intelligent at the same time. Let me explain. Make no mistake about it, I value my freedom, and I'm definitely in a better place insofar as where I'm at in life right now. But it's still hard to come to terms with some of the things I had to do in order to get to where I am today. I've always said that it'll always be something that I'll always regret and that I'll always struggle with. Those that don't fully understand that lifestyle and what it's like when this is all you've ever come to know in life might think that this sounds stupid or that it's a no-brainer. But for some of us, it just ain't that easy. I wish it was. I wish I could just hit a switch and turn it on and off, or hit the reset button, but it just don't work like that. In other words, I'm sure there's a lot of people who weren't part of that world who will say, man, you got a second chance. You're in a better place, so don't look back and dwell on the negative things about it. I understand that. And from an outsider's perspective, I get it and couldn't agree anymore. But at the same time, when you come from that element and it's become a way of life for you for sometimes 20, 30, or even 40 years, it's hard to make that transition because it's not like it's a job or something you do in life for a hobby to pass time. Your heart's in it, and your belief system is not only shaped by it, but it also becomes second nature, something you wholeheartedly believe in. That's why it still bothers me. That's why I'm not able to just turn it off like a lot of people seem to think is possible. Regardless to what people say about me, I was a true believer. I gave up all those years of my life because I believed in the cause when it was first explained to me. Back then, the cause was a beautiful thing. It represented something I truly believed in, and it was something I put my life on the line for. I could go on and on about it, but the bottom line is this. What happened happened. There are no reset buttons and there are no do-overs. That's just the way it is. So all I do now is try to make the best of it and try to find some semblance in the life I'm now living. I spend each day trying to be a better man than I was the day before. To wrap this up, let me just say this. I've never claimed to be completely rehabilitated, and I've never claimed that I don't sometimes fall back into the alter ego boxer's way of thinking. It's a daily ongoing struggle for me. Sometimes I have to catch myself and rein myself back in. I have to remind myself about the adversity that I was once exposed to and use that to shake me back on track. But I'll never take any steps backwards. I'll never allow myself to relegate back towards or into the toxic cesspool that I wallowed in for almost 3 decades. Nobody is going to do that for me. Nobody's going to be that guiding light or that voice of reason whenever I begin to deviate. So I have to do it for myself. So Airman Esposa wants to know, what's the worst call you've ever bared witness to besides them jumping the gun on your situation? There's actually 3 I can think of off the top of my head. The first one was the hit on Sapo from Oakland. I've mentioned this to you guys several times in the past. I actually participated in this one. That was clearly a bad call, and even though I knew it was wrong and questioned it in my mind at the time, I was only 19 years old and I wasn't in any position to refuse a directive from the individual who was designated as our OA. Another bad call was the hit on George Lucky Mendoza that I just recently told you guys about. This is the C that Skip wanted hit simply because Lucky was dating a female named Mommy who had previously been involved with his homeboy Pony. I knew this was all based on personal feelings, so I didn't sanction the hit and I refused to do it. But Lencho's greasy ass made sure it was done as soon as I left. Because Lynch was the kind of individual who would rather follow the rest of the herd over the cliff instead of taking the lead and letting everyone know why it's bad to run off that cliff. MC and Brown Bob are two more bad calls that will forever loom over the organization as dark clouds and bad calls. I don't think there's a single member of the organization who's active or inactive that doesn't agree that these two calls were two of the worst fuck-ups in NF history. Even though both of these incidents happened years ago, the NF is still feeling the negative effects in some way, shape, or form. So Carlos Orozco wants to know, who was the SRG at the time of the MC hit? Who was the one who gave the green light for him to get hit? Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba from Tulare County was the interim SRG general at the time MC was killed. At the time, Joseph Pinky Hernandez had just been indicted out of Santa Clara County and was OTC pending resolution of this case. While Pinky was OTC, Cuete was appointed to act as a temporary liaison to the SRG, or the interim SRG general. Cuete was also part of a counseling body that was implemented by leadership that was called Cinco Nueve, or 5-9 in English. Cinco Nueve was a representation of the 5 high-ranking C's: Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba from Tulare County, David D.C. Cervantes from Chino, Cornelius Corny Tristan from Woodland, Marin Tex Hernandez from Salinas, and James Tibbs Murato from Modesto, that were all housed in 9 Block C facility. As soon as Cuete was appointed this position, he didn't waste any time implementing some of his ill-conceived ideas. The first thing he did was set in motion a chain of events to have Robert Brown Bob Viramontes killed for his suspected role in the D facility dilemmas. Contrary to what some of the others in leadership positions might say, they were all well aware of what his intentions were, because I was there in C2 when they were priming up Bad Boy from Corcoran to go out there and complete the assignment. The next thing Cuete did was to begin filtering out his mandates that were all part of an orchestrated agenda to assert more control and influence over all norteños. This was clearly just a power grab by Cuete, and a lot of norteños looked at this as nothing more than a calculated way of strong-arming all those that weren't affiliated and forcing them to play NF politics. The killing of MC was something that was a little more complex. It was orchestrated by both Cuete and Tex, who played different roles with different positions. Cuete was tied in as the interim SRG, who basically became accountable because of his dealings with overseeing Lizard, and Tex was directly responsible because he personally sanctioned the green light to Rico and Lobo. The common denominator is that it was all money motivated. At least it was for Tex. As long as Rico and Lobo held down the RC position and managed to isolate MC, Tex stood to gain a lot of money, and this is why he was relegated. Cuete might not have been pushing that same agenda, but he was tied in with Lizard and how Lizard was controlling the streets as his regional street administrator. After MC was killed, Corny, Tibbs, and Pinky conducted a full-scale investigation into how he died and who sanctioned the green light. At the onset of the investigation, Corny moved in with Tex, knowing that Tex had some degree of involvement, and also because it was alleged that Tex was the one who authorized the green light to Rico and Lobo. The whole purpose for Corny moving in with Tex was to kill Tex if the investigation found malfeasance or ill intentions on Tex's part. Needless to say, the investigation revealed a sinister plot between Tex, Rico, and Lobo to kill MC for personal and financial reasons. Cuete was also held to answer for his own malfeasance when it came to his personal dealings with Lizard, the Salinas Regiment, and other financial misappropriations. Initially, Rico, Lobo, and others who were functioning in the Salinas Regiment were all deemed no good. However, these green lights were later rescinded, and the organization was advised that this incident would go down as a valuable learning experience. Cuete and Tex's fate was a little more complex because of their Cat 3 statuses, but eventually it was decided that they would both face relegation and demotion opposed to expulsion. In my opinion, an opinion that was shared by many C's at the time, this was just fancy verbiage to coordinate a cover-up and to smokescreen the truth that a high-ranking loyal C had been killed unscrupulously at the hands of the organization. When Cuete and Tex were both relegated and demoted, it was also stipulated that neither one of these C's would ever hold a position of authority within the organization ever again, nor would they ever elevate from their Category 1 status. This is why they are hardly ever even spoken on and have almost been completely banished. The only reason why Cuete's name was recently mentioned is because he was performing cleanup when he was ordered to hit Tibbs. Cleanup is something both Cuete and Tex will owe for the duration. So Joe Bananas 415 wants to know, were you there to aid or have any part in running off the Samoans when they tried to plant their flag in front of Jack in the Box on 24th back in the early 90s? I remember that situation, but I wasn't personally involved. This is a joke though, right? What Samoans are you talking about? The ones from Army Street or some other Samoans? Because I remember a couple incidents that did happen out there where them cats shot at us on Folsom and 24th Street. But I'm not aware of any Jack in the Box on 24th and Mission. I'm only aware of the McDonald's that's been there for over 40 years. Dennis Whitlock Jr. wants to know, do you believe California prisons breed hate? We're conditioned to hate our enemies. But do you believe prison breeds hatred of race? Most definitely. California prisons have long been known for promoting hate and antagonism in its prison system for years. A lot of this is generated from the corruption some of the prison administrations have imposed on the prison system they oversee themselves, and the internal corruption that's become conventionalized, like the Green Wall. Hatred is generated almost by default, as segregation has been a long-standing practice that CDCR has relied on to separate gang members and different ethnic groups. History has shown us how prevalent hatred has become in the California prison system when you look all the way back to the 60s and 70s. Racism and segregation was openly promoted, and back in those days, race riots were a normal and customary part of the program. The Shoe Wars is another good example of how CDCR promotes hatred and why it's not in favor of seeing the different gangs and different races unified. That's why they're mad right now, because of the Anti-Hostilities Agreement. Mr. Castro wants to know, hey Boxer, I'm a new sub. Can you send my mom a happy birthday shout out? Her name is Rosa Amesta. Sorry if I killed her last name, man. Amesta. Happy birthday, Rosa. I know this is probably going to be posted a little late, but better than never. On behalf of Paradigm Media News and your son, I'd like to wish Rosa Amzeta a very special belated happy birthday, and we'd also like to wish you many, many more to come. So Robert Campos wants to know, what do you think about these young northerners in their teens and 20s nowadays compared to the northerners from the 90s in your era? As far as the young northerners in their teens and 20s nowadays, well, this is definitely a whole different kind of generation from the one I remember when I was coming up. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good young homies who have been groomed right and who function like they're supposed to, but a lot of these youngsters are just different. Everything from their mentality, the way in which they perceive things, the way they walk, the way they talk, their stilo, and the depth of their loyalty are all things that have changed over the years. Just look at the BNLs nowadays. Most of the numbers you're going to see are newer numbers. They're from youngsters who were checked out because the lifestyle was too rough for them. The one thing I will say is that a lot of these youngsters don't adapt well when it comes to adversity or some of the hardships that they encounter during their careers. This is evident by the massive numbers of young homies who end up falling into bad standings these days. The numbers don't lie. I'm not going to say it applies across the board, but I've just noticed that when it comes to making certain sacrifices, like participating in removals, catching more time, or fulfilling different aspects of their commitments, they either fall short or refuse to carry these things out. My generation was built a little different. We didn't use the N-word. None of us talked like that, and we understood the concept of respect. I understand that it has a lot to do with the entire American culture continuously changing and transforming, but even their mentality and their level of fidelity has waned over the years. As far as the stilo of this new generation, first we had the Pepsi generation. Now we're seeing the skinny jean generation. And whether it's the Pepsi or the skinny jean generation, the one thing that's definitely changed is that neither one of these generations is pushing that lifestyle or the gangbang mentality like it used to be pushed when I was coming up. First, they wore their pants too baggy. Now they're too tight. Why can't these guys get it right, man? Shit. So Sandy Estrada wants to know, do you live a normal life or do you feel like you gotta look over your shoulder everywhere you go? I don't think I'll ever be able to say that I live a completely normal life per se, but I can say that I live as close to a normal life that I can. The reason I say that is this: it doesn't matter what I do in order to achieve normalcy in my life. I can do everything that I should be doing. I can make wise decisions. I can always remain mindful of where I go and who I allow to be part of my social circles, and I can just be smart about the things I do. But despite what I do, I'm always going to have a target on my back, no matter what. That won't ever change, so I'll never have that complete normalcy that most people have. I've got to continue being smart for the rest of my life. It would be foolish if I ever allowed myself to get too complacent or too comfortable that I drop my guard and stop taking some of the precautions that I do. Don't get me wrong, I don't live my life like a paranoid schizophrenic looking over my shoulder every 5 minutes in constant fear of what might happen either. When I was still in the county jail going through my dilemmas, I thought about all this and I vowed to never live my life like that. I vowed to myself that if I couldn't function in life without that kind of constant paralyzing fear, then I'd just spend the rest of my life in prison and take whatever they had for me if I blew trial. So this is what I've done, and this is how I live my life since I've been home. I don't hide under any rocks. I don't disguise myself or do anything to alter the way I look in public. That's not the type of lifestyle I wanted to live, and there's no quality of life about that. I do all the normal things that most of you do. I go to Walmart. I go out to eat at different restaurants. I go grocery shopping at regular supermarkets like Safeway, just like everyone else. I'm just smart about the things I do. I don't put myself in situations where the likelihood of something happening is greater, and I don't do things to draw unnecessary attention to myself. So that's my kind of normalcy. So Sergio Martinez wants to know, can you describe or confirm Epi from San Jose's affiliation with NF? I've seen him in several gang documentaries. I think his name is Epifanio. There you go. The one with the funny shaped head. I'm sure you guys can figure it out by looking at the picture. Look, I don't have nothing bad to say about Epi, and I'm not slamming him for anything he's done. At the end of the day, it's his business. It's nothing personal. But my thing is this. What I don't understand is why Epi, or guys like Epi, go on TV and blatantly lie when it comes to his status or what he was involved in. There's no reason why anyone should fabricate, embellish, or exaggerate the details of their stories. Epi did a segment on Gangland or Lockup, and he basically lied and exaggerated everything he said about himself. I was watching it and laughing at the same time, man. I was like, God damn, boy. I'm assuming that his whole purpose for doing the interview was to denigrate the gang philosophy and to discourage younger kids from going to prison. At least that's why the majority of those guys give those types of interviews anyway. So with that being said, there's no reason to lie, embellish, or enhance any of the details they claim took place when it comes to them or their experiences with whatever type of criminal organization they once belonged to. In other words, they don't need to lie in order to denigrate the lifestyle or the things they were once involved in. They can still speak the gospel without fabricating it, and their stories can still be beneficial without having to do all that. A lot of these guys who exaggerate their stories always claim that they were leaders, that they held certain elevated positions, that they overseen certain areas, and that they were involved in things that they weren't involved in. Maybe it's a kick to their ego to have to admit and come to terms with the fact that they weren't part of the leadership and that they didn't hold any of these elevated positions. Maybe in their minds it makes them feel inferior, or maybe it makes them feel like it takes something away from their credibility as a real one. I don't know, but I think it actually hurts them more when they lie and claim to be something that they weren't, especially in the eyes of those of us who know better. I was in Pelican Bay when Epi was recruited into the Familia. I was there when his name was being circulated and filtered out as one of the new C's who were brought into the fold. I remember it vividly because at the time it was my job to maintain a master roster of all the C's who were present within the SHU or within that household. And I was also there when he walked away and decided that that lifestyle wasn't for him anymore. Trust me, the amount of time that he was brought in was short-lived. And although I can't remember exactly how long it was, I do know for sure that he never held a position within the organization and that it couldn't have been longer than a couple of months. So the next time I see or hear anything about Epi again was when he came out on gangland or lockup and I hear the lies he claimed in that segment. According to him, he was in charge of San Jose at one time. He was the regimental commander and he claimed that he personally orchestrated robberies, armored car robberies, murder, and mayhem. These were all lies. Come on, man. He was never in charge of San Jose. He never helped orchestrate any of the things he claimed he did. And he was never appointed the regimental commander of the San Jose regiment like he claimed. Bottom line, it was all good for TV and I'm sure he looked impressive to a lot of people. But on the other hand, he lost all his credibility and he just made himself look bad for lying. And when's the last time the NF did an armored car robbery? Come on, Epi, you shouldn't have said that. So that about thumbs things up for Epi, and that's why I've addressed him the way I have in the past whenever I've heard his name come up. So Levi truly wants to know, if you had to do it all over again, the prison stints, the lifestyle, all your experiences and people met in the NF, everything, would you? Or if you could go back and never be a part of it, win a different way, would you do that? I ask because I'm sure there were some valuable morals and situations you learned from it, especially courage and discipline with all the stuff you've done. First of all, you are absolutely correct about one thing. I undoubtedly learned a lot through my experiences, and no matter how you cut it, these are the kind of experiences that shaped me and helped me become stronger in a lot of different ways. All the things you touched on, morals, courage, discipline, resilience, and diligence, were things that I learned as a result of my experiences. Even though there's a lot of people who consider the NF to be a criminal organization, an organization that's fraught with corruption, duplicity, and misfeasance, not malfeasance, but misfeasance, and an organization that's subjective, preying on its own and victimizing its own people, I can't say that all my experiences or all my lessons have been bad. Some of the positive things that the NF continue to pursue vigorously is education. You're always encouraged to absorb as much knowledge as you possibly can, and such things like learning a degree or a trade is something that's considered to be an accomplishment. Going to school, learning how to enhance better business acumen, learning how to invest and establish legitimate businesses, reading and improving your vocabulary are all positive things that the NF pushes. It only becomes negative when it comes to how the NF wants you to apply that knowledge. As far as if I would do it all over again just for the sake of possibly being better the second time around, I'd have to say no. This was almost 40 years of wasted time. I didn't accomplish nothing except for losing all those years, having nothing to show for it, and causing a lot of damage and destruction along the way. I've been able to do more in these last few years than I did the entire time during that whole 40 years. A big part of this is because I allowed the blinders to come off and I allowed myself to step outside of that little dark corner that I've kept myself trapped in for all those years. There's a bigger world out there that a lot of us never allow ourselves to see. It's like having tunnel vision and never allowing yourself to see beyond that small world we confine ourselves to. Some of us have never even been outside the state of California. That's a shame, man. Some have never been outside their own county lines, unless it was on the Grey Goose going back to prison. How many NF members can say they've been on the beaches of Cabo San Lucas horseback riding or watching the whales surface in Hawaii? Not too many, man. That's real. I doubt there's that many. In the third part of your question, you asked if I do it all over again or if I go in another direction. I'll put it to you like this. I guess the one thing that I did walk away with was perspective. Going through everything that I did and seeing all the things that I have enabled me to learn from the mistakes I made and only reconfirmed just how much time in life I really wasted. You asked if I go in another direction, if I could do it all over again. Absolutely. I do everything opposite from how I did it before. Instead of aspiring to be a shot caller and aspiring to run some prison, in the state of California, I definitely broaden my horizons and aspire to be something more than just a shot caller in prison. There's no future in that. Who cares about that in the real world, man? The real gangsters in this life become shot callers in the free world. They become CEOs of major corporations and control thousands of people in that company. They own 5 or 6 houses, as many cars as they want. They travel the world at will and do it flying in their own personal jet. That's what I'd aspire to be if I had a second chance to do it all over again. Those are the real bosses, or the real gangsters. The ones who learn how to climb to the top of the apex in the real world. In retrospect, being able to look back and say, I was running this prison, I was the regimental commander in these different Northern California cities, I controlled this many individuals who fell under my authority, etc., means nothing. Who cares about all that in the real world? There's nothing to gain from it except to look really cool by other people who still glorify that lifestyle and who think it means something to run a criminal organization. So P559 wants to know, over the years I've noticed that the sophistication regarding taxation in the neighborhoods has dramatically increased. However, it still seems to be unclear on how or if any of those funds are properly allocated. From your experience, do any of those funds make their way towards helping out neighborhoods, incarcerated individuals, and their families? Or does it simply make its way to the top and never comes down? This is something I've touched on before, and the only reason why I have a solid perspective on this is because I function at an elevated level where all these things became visible to me. Like I said before, there is no trickle-down effect. There's only a trickle-up effect, and this money is controlled and kept amongst those at the top of the organization, leadership. As far as how the money's allocated, I can honestly say that the only money that I've ever seen get sent back into prison for those less fortunate members that need it and who don't have a means of taking care of themselves is the $200 that's required by those that make parole. I've seen that happen on a regular basis. But this isn't the money that's generated from the street regiments. According to the NF street objectives and the NF's sole purpose for taking its vision to the streets, insofar as street regiments, there are several purposes that have been laid out and clarified. The main primary purpose is so that the organization can become self-sustaining, self-solving, and so that it can basically sustain itself. You learn this when you're indoctrinated on the street functions and you're taught not only the purpose of the NF street regiments, but also what it is the NF is trying to achieve. Some of this money that's generated from the street regiments is supposed to be reinvested in weaponry, drugs, and other materials needed in order to break new ground. But in my experience, even this money grows. Because let's just say, for example, I was getting out next month and I was getting paroled to an area that wasn't established. I have the option of borrowing $25,000 to help me establish my regiment, but this money is taken out as a loan. I would have to pay interest on it. That's something that I always thought was kind of weird, but that's how it's set up. The other thing about getting that $25,000 is that it's not easy to get the loan paid out either. It's a complex process that a lot of C's won't even mess with. One of the other reasons a lot of C's won't touch that money is because once they get it, they are 100% responsible for it, and that's a big responsibility to shoulder. Because let's just say I borrow that money and then get raided and locked up a week later. The cops kick in my door and catch me dirty with a couple pounds that I just invested in. Well, guess what happens? I'm still responsible for paying back that money. It's not like they say, okay, let's chalk that up as a loss. The brother got hemmed up, so there's nothing he can do to get that money back. It don't matter. It don't work like that. As unreasonable as it may sound, they expect you to pay that money back, even if it calls for you to squeeze blood out of a turnip. That's how it works, and that's how a lot of C's get caught up. But back to the money and how it's supposed to be allocated. So the money that comes in is also to be used to assist with attorney fees when good C's get caught up and catch cases. I was initially told to sit tight and that attorney money would be coming. 2 years after I hit the county jail, and I was still there waiting for that money that was never going to materialize. It was never coming. Because if you really want to be honest about it and what happens, greed always prevents that money from ever coming to fruition. That's the bottom line. The brothers know you're busted. They pretty much assume you're done. And the general consensus is that you're probably going to catch a life case. You're going to get convicted and you're going to get put up on the shelf with all the other C's who are locked up. So you become a liability, just another hungry mouth to feed, like I always say. Because once you become a lifer and you catch that life case, you're pretty much no longer useful when it comes to generating money for the organization. And that's what it's all about now. The only ones who remain assets are the C's who still have a date or who still have action at making it back out to the streets. That's just the reality of it. And I'll just cap this off with this closing thought. One of the things I noticed whenever I would make these huge deposits from the money we were all generating from the streets is this. Those select few at the top of the organization who would receive this money and who would take control of these deposits would then divvy this money up, and they had some type of agreement insofar as how it was split up amongst them. Then, once it was divvied up, the thing that always stood out to me is that they always had a habit of referring to it as mine or my money. Only those select few at the top know how it was divvied up. These are agreements they had amongst each other. But at the time, I just remember thinking that it was all a sham, that these cats were only fattening up their pockets, and that this is the way it really works. So that's pretty much how the money's allocated and controlled at the top. So Devontrez Haynes wants to know, I'm not sure if this question has been asked before, but in all your years, did you ever think you would be on YouTube talking about your former life to thousands of strangers? Is the boxing event and your YouTube platform a way for you to hustle? And how did your schooling play into this? No, of course, I never imagined that I'd be on YouTube exposing all the blueprints and all the internal workings of the NF. I never imagined that I would have done a lot of things that I have done since I separated myself from the organization. To be honest with you, I never thought I'd ever fall into bad standings with the NF. But things happen that we can't always predict, and that's just the reality of it. My mindset has changed a little over the years as I see things from a different lens now. But talking to thousands of strangers on YouTube about NF politics would have been something that I would have perceived to be as an act of dishonor. My thinking back then would have been like, only degenerates give up the blueprints and expose the codes we live and die by. As far as the boxing event and using my platform on YouTube as a way to hustle and make money legitimately, that's a big no. Straight up, those that know me and who are familiar with my financial status know that I don't have to go as far as putting on a boxing event to make some money. It's not about that for me, and I just don't have to do all that. It ain't that serious, man. I'm fine with or without this boxing event, and to be honest with you, it's actually more of a headache to put it on than it is if I just decided not to do it at all. I'm doing it for entertainment purposes, and secondly, I'm doing this as just a personal goal for myself. I'm sure you see a lot of the comments. There's a lot of naysayers that say 51 years old is too old to compete in an event like this. Or other people will say that I'm not in the kind of shape I need to be in order to look good getting in the ring. I'm okay with people doubting me because that's what's ultimately motivating me. I don't want to just go in there and win, but I also want to go in there and look good doing it. The personal goal that I'm setting for myself that I want to prove to people is that I can still do something like this at 51 if I put my mind to it, and that I'm still capable of doing all the things that I need to in order to make it happen, i.e. losing all the weight, getting myself back in boxing shape, building up my cardio, etc., etc. So there's a lot more involved than just saying, okay, I'm going to jump in the ring and put on a boxing event in 3 months. I had to commit to living a healthier lifestyle for 90 days. And then there's the whole other side of it that requires preparation, location, camera crew, referee, announcers, ring girls, ticket availability, security, and promotion. Just trust me when I say that there's a lot involved and that it takes a lot of involvement to get it done. And to be completely honest with you, with the overhead and with all the people involved, there's not a lot to be made when it's all said and done. I know that there's a lot of people who seem to be under the impression that there's thousands and thousands of dollars to be made, but that's just not the case, and they obviously don't know what they're talking about. The other thing is this. When the first event was put on, there were a lot of people who were dropping comments expressing their interest in seeing me get in the ring and fight myself. I couldn't just ignore those comments and at least try to make an effort to give them what they wanted. So that was another part of it, and that's what it's about for me. So Miguel Losa wants to know, you still have NF tattooed on the back of your head? No, I got the Nuestra Familia that was tattooed on the back of my head, covered up with a big Aztec style warbird. Initially I tried to have it lasered off, but the ink was too dark, so I eventually just decided to go with the cover up. This kind of ties into one of the earlier answers about doing things so as to not draw unnecessary attention to myself. Removing that tattoo was all about deflecting the type of attention I would have continued to get if I would have still been walking around advertising that tattoo. So Local wants to know, there aren't any actives on integrated yards. 50-50 yards are bad yards. You're throwing in the towel if you choose to stay on those yards. Just FYI, because I've heard you say a few times that their beliefs have changed. Local, I'm not saying that you don't know what you're talking about, but let me just clarify what I said in the past and where I think the confusion comes into play. I don't know what you mean by an integrated yard, but what I've been referring to are some of the general population yards that CDCR classifies as a non-designated yard. Some of these yards were previously called sensitive need yards, or SNYs. So when you put it in perspective like you did, you are absolutely correct. Staying on a yard like this basically means that you're throwing in the towel and that you're staying on a yard that is considered to be no good. But here's where all the confusion comes in, and this was all explained in the phone call I had with Trigger from San Jose 12th Street. It's already known that CDCR has decided to abolish the SNYs and to transform these yards into 50-50 yards. This is a blended yard composed of half SNY and half as active or GP. Now I still stand by what I said insofar as when I said that beliefs of the inmates are changing and how these active inmates have basically allowed CDCR to push them into a corner. There's no way around it. You heard Trigger lay all this out in his interview, but again, here's where the confusion is. According to Trigger, the Northerners, the Southerners, and the whites that are out there on the yard with him were pretty much done. They were all in the hat and considered SNY. That much is understood, so we agree with that much. But then he said that the Africanos and the others are general population mainliners who are not SNY. In other words, these guys know that they're out there with SNY inmates and that these guys are basically all in the hat. That's why I said the mentality and the belief system has changed, because 20 or 25 years ago, they wouldn't have been okay with programming out there with these guys. What's obviously missing is the active Northerners, Southerners, and whites. For argument's sake, let's say that these guys aren't out there, the ones who really consider themselves active, because they push their own politics a little different. They look at it like this: if you're out there with them, then you're basically with them and you're guilty by association. I'm sure we agree up until at least that point. Because again, according to Trigger, you see what happens when they bring a real active Northerner or Southerner out there. It's mandatory for them to get off, or they're considered to be trash and they degenerate themselves. We all know that that's how it works. When you're active, there's yards that are designated good yards, and then there's yards that are designated bad yards. This is well known, and if you're en route to one of these yards, it's usually mandatory to get off as soon as you get there, or sometimes, depending on the circumstances, you might be given 24 hours so that you can make a weapon. Now let me just say this: COVID kind of pushed everything back. It stopped what CDCR was doing, and although CDCR started a pilot program on some of the lower level yards, the 1 and the 2 yards, they're going to start kicking their pilot program back in motion sometime soon, since COVID is starting to level out. It's all part of their plan, and eventually this is going to start to be implemented on some of the level 3 and 4 yards. The only reason they haven't yet is because everyone knows that this has to be phased in, and when it's implemented on the higher level yards, everyone knows that this is when the killing is really going to start. But they're going to use these non-designated yards as tools to either make it work or to prevent people from making parole. Watch. So unless someone introduces some type of class action suit to change this, like they did with the debriefing process, this is what they can expect in the very near future. A lot of people are making parole right now. The statistics have already shown that more people are getting granted parole than ever before in the history of CDCR. But this is where it's going to get interesting. CDCR weaponized the debriefing process as a tool to prevent a lot of people from either getting out of the SHU or making parole. If you wanted to get out of the SHU or go home, debriefing was a requirement. That's why so many people did it. But now that CDCR has been stripped of its debriefing weapon and has nothing it can use to maintain control over these guys, it's going to use these non-designated yards as a weapon to either grant or deny parole. Trigger summed it all up himself when he said, these kinds of yards are basically for guys who want to go home. Eventually, these guys who consider themselves to be fully active are going to be forced to make a choice. They're either going to conform with the program so that they can eventually make parole and go home, or they can continue to push that line and call themselves fully active. We'll see what happens. So Pyro Gen 4 wants to know, why didn't David Rocha get a green light? Who said he didn't? He did get a green light. He was deemed no good and a green light was sanctioned on him at the Santa Rita County Jail. However, according to David, he got a pass from Henry Big Happy Cervantes from Lodi. In fact, David talks about this extensively himself in several of his interviews that can all be seen right here on YouTube. Look up some of his videos. I believe he discusses this in one interview he did for sure with Tony A on Rhodium Radio. Anyways, according to David, he became aware of the homies putting a green light on him in the Santa Rita County Jail when the individual who was supposed to hit him came to him and confessed that this is what the homies were directing him to do. Bear in mind that this is his story, not mine. I'm not putting my stamp on it, and I can't confirm whether it really happened or not. But either way, it sounds good and makes a good testimonial when it comes to his whole religious thing. So whether it's to be believed or not is a matter of what you personally think about it. David claims that this guy who came to him, who came to do harm to him, actually refused after he confessed that he then accepted God into his life. Again, this ain't a slam on David, but to me, this just sounded like another one of them dramatic religious stories that had one of them miraculous happy endings. Aside from this, he then claimed that Big Happy from Lodi, who is a well-known high-ranking NF member, gave him a pass and told him that he gave him his blessings with regard to his religious conversion and his decision to become a man of God. David said Big Happy told him that as long as his conversion was real, he'd stand behind him and give him his blessing. Is it believable? Sure it is. Is it possible that it's fabricated? Sure it is. But I'm not here to pass judgment. I'm just giving you the facts. The one thing I can and will say about David is this. After looking back on it all, I'm more than convinced that his conversion and his beliefs are in fact real. And this is evident based on the fact that he not only continued to pursue his religious conversion once he was released, but he took it a step further by becoming a pastor for his own church as well. So Colonel Sander wants to know what happened to Yogi Pinnell. Hugo Yogi Pinnell was a former Black Panther Party leader who gained worldwide notoriety because of his participation in 1971 in what was widely known as the San Quentin Six. He was also known to be one of the few true revolutionaries who fought alongside George Jackson in an effort to suppress black oppression within the California prison system. Once the Black Panther Party began to phase out in the late 70s, early 80s, Yogi continued his plight by becoming a member of the Black Guerrilla Family, or the BGF. After spending close to 40 years in isolation, Yogi was released back to a general population mainline, with hundreds of other inmates in California after Todd Ashker and Danny Troxel prevailed in their class action lawsuit challenging long-term isolation. On August 12, 2015, Yogi was stabbed and killed in Folsom State Prison by two white inmates who had close ties to the Aryan Brotherhood. Whether he was killed behind personal reasons or because of his status as a high-ranking BGF member, a lot of people familiar with the incident believe that he was targeted solely because of who he was and what he had been involved in. I've done several spills on Yogi in the past, and I have answered a lot of questions about them. So if you're still looking for more details, I would suggest that you go through some of my past videos or some of my past Q&As. So U2F Keys wants to know, do you live in hiding or you live in a regular life out in the open? I'm going to keep this simple as I've already answered a similar question. In short, I live as close to a normal life as I possibly can. Like I said in one of my aforementioned questions, I'd be a fool to think or say that my life has ever returned to complete normalcy, because it hasn't and it won't. I'll always have a target on my back, so I've always got to be conscious of the decisions I make, and these decisions always have to be based on security. Even if I was allowing myself to slip back into complete complacency, I have to think about the safety and security of other people around me and how they can possibly be affected. The last thing I would ever want to happen is for anyone in my family or any of my loved ones to get hurt because I failed to take those necessary precautions. A lot of people have asked me how and why I'm still breathing if the NF has put a price on my head. Don't make any misconceptions about it. Just because I haven't been hit yet doesn't mean it still can or won't happen in the future, and it sure doesn't mean that the NF has went to sleep on me. They would still score major brownie points if they whacked me, so this is something that I'm definitely not in denial about. One of the other main reasons why I still have air in my lungs is because my street savviness or my street smarts has enabled me to be smart about what I decide to do and how I decide to do it. But as I also touched on in my previous answer, I don't live my life in a heightened state of paranoia either. I'm not hiding. I don't alter or change my appearance, and I'm not buried under some rock somewhere. I try to live as close to a normal life as I possibly can, but this also entails being smart about it and avoiding putting myself in situations that might make the likelihood of something happening greater. So Full 60 wants to know, in your book you mentioned a guy named Pantera. Was he the guy that killed your father? Is that the same Pantera that was in Deep Facility Dilemmas? Yes, sir, you are absolutely correct. The Pantera that was involved in the whole Deep Facility Dilemmas is the same Pantera who killed my father. His name is Pablo Pantera Peña from San Jose. This is another question that I've already answered previously before in the past, and that I believe I also mentioned in my book. I've already elaborated on this before, so I'm going to keep this short. But when I found out about this, I was already aspiring to be a C, and I was told about it by complete coincidence. It's just ironic how things in life sometimes work. Here I was aspiring to be a C. I had already been at Hermano for close to 6 years, and then I inadvertently find out that I was aspiring to be a part of an organization whose hands had killed my biological father. Trust me, I was shocked when I found out about it, but it still didn't shake my resolve or discourage me from making that commitment. So Merc209 wants to know, can you be pulled as an NF member on the streets without doing any prison time? This is a typo. The original question, I believe, is an NF member. And even if it was an NR member, to answer your question in short, yes, you can be pulled as an NR member on the streets without going to prison as well, but this applies to the NF. There's no protocol or there's nothing that stipulates that prison must be a requirement in order to be recruited into the NF or the NR. It's rare that these kinds of situations transpire or that C's are recruited in this fashion, but I'll tell you why. It's usually preferred that newly recruited C's are recruited from the ranks of the NR and that they have been to prison, as prison teaches you valuable lessons that can only be learned through hands-on experience. But again, it's not mandatory. Traditionally, NR members who have proven their loyalty and who have demonstrated that they're ready to make that type of commitment are then recruited and brought into the fold. That's the traditional way though. There's no template or exact blueprint for it. It just depends on the individual, and it's on a case-by-case basis. If it's someone who has shown unyielding loyalty and they have something very beneficial to offer the organization, then it's very likely that they'll be recruited and pulled in. The circumstances all depend on the individual though. Becoming a member of the NF is not for everyone. It's a serious lifestyle that most people can't cope with. There's even some hermanos who aren't cut out for it, and they're told that they'll never fit the mold. But to answer your question in short, no, you don't have to go to prison in order to be pulled in to either the NF or the NR. So 408 Spreading Jill wants to know, if one kills a homie on the streets, is he getting hit when he hits the county jail? Does it depend on status or reason why? No. This is a question that I've been asked before because unfortunately, this is one of those situations that sometimes happens. Every scenario is different, but what it all comes down to is this: what happened, who was involved, and what was behind it. If you're just talking about an issue between two young homies that escalates to the point to where one of them ends up taking out the other one, then it's more than likely that nothing will come of it. If you're talking about an NF or an NR member who's been around, who's well known out there, and who's functioning in one of the street regiments, then it's probably going to become an issue for the perpetrator once he hits the county jail. You can't just go around whacking homies that are connected and think it's not going to become an issue. If a northerner whacks a C out there on the streets, whether it's personal or whether the C had it coming or not, the northerner's probably going to be in trouble when he hits the county jail. That's just the way it goes. Now here's another scenario. Let's say that there's an NR member out there who's just doing his own thing. He's not functioning in the regiment, and maybe he pushes up on a northerner and straight tries bullying him. In this situation, it would probably get investigated, and if it was handled right, nothing would happen to the little homie or to the other homie. It would obviously be up to whoever overseeing the investigation, but if I encountered a situation like this and I determined that the NR member was in the wrong, I'd probably clear the other homie who was charged with killing him and give him a pass. What's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. Status doesn't give you carte blanche to abuse other homies or to go around bullying homies who are under you. So Allen Boy wants to know, I have never interacted with a northern convict or ex-convict for that matter. I've done time throughout California since I was 13 years old, and I've been free for over 20 years. Do you ever feel like a coward if a person disrespects you? I do. You stated that you've done time in California since you were 13 years old and that you've never interacted with a northern convict before. You also stated that you've been free for over 20 years. First of all, kudos to you for maintaining your freedom for that long and for obviously turning your life in another direction. To some people, that might not seem like much of an accomplishment because they've never been in trouble. But for someone like me, it's a major accomplishment and I commend you. As far as never interacting with northerners that are ex-convicts, I find that hard to believe, especially since you've been doing time since you were 13. But they're just like anyone else, so you're not missing anything. With regard to the last part of your question about whether or not I feel like a coward if someone disrespects me, I wouldn't say that I feel like a coward if someone disrespects me, as I can't control what other people decide to do. However, where I start to feel like my honor is on the line is when it comes to what I decide to do about it. I'm a hothead. I've always been like that, and I'm the type of person who's always been quick to be confrontational and aggressive when I feel like someone's being disrespectful. But over the years, I've become more humble, and now I try to pick my battles. Instead of always resorting to physical violence as my first option, sometimes I'll respond to someone with words of intelligence. It's not always about talking shit to someone when they talk shit or say something stupid. Sometimes you gotta respond by beating them down with intelligence. Sometimes this has more of an effect than an ass whooping. If you beat someone down with words and make them realize how stupid they're being, then it'll have that same effect or even more of a profound effect than it would have if you were to sock them up. I've got to pick my battles and think about my freedom too. If I run across someone out here who's being stupid and I take it there, I've got to think about what might happen if the cops end up showing up too. I've got the wrong paint job and I don't exactly fit the type of profile cops are going to be sympathetic and understanding to either. For example, the other day I was driving somewhere, minding my own fucking business, not fucking with anyone, when all of a sudden a car rolled past me and squirted water on my window. My first instinct was to gun it, bust a U-turn, and to catch up to whoever this motherfucker was. And that's exactly what I did. I ended up catching up to the car, and come to find out, it was 4 young white guys who looked to be somewhere in their early to mid-20s. I pulled up right beside them and told them, check it out. There's 4 of you and 1 of me. Let's pull over and see who the real bitch is. you motherfuckers were bad enough to throw water on my car like bitches, then you should be bad enough to pull over. Needless to say, none of them said anything. They just looked at me and continued to drive. My guess is they didn't really get a good look at me when they threw the water, and that the one in the back seat did it just to show out in front of his friends. Ooh, look how tough I am. I threw some water on that car. But then when they seen I wasn't just some Joe Blow, they decided it probably wasn't a good idea to pull over. Trust me, I was upset too. Anyway, because they wouldn't stop, I pulled in front of them and started to get out. I basically cut them off. The one in the back seat was gonna get socked in the eye. There was nothing else to say. But these clowns gunned it in reverse and slid around me. At that point, I just said, fuck it. I'm not gonna chase these fools, and it's obvious they don't want it, so I'm just gonna let it go. I was upset for about another 30 minutes after this shit was over, and they were long gone. But when I started thinking about what probably would have happened if the cops showed up, it kind of put it all in perspective for me, and I realized that I probably just dodged a bullet. I would have put my hands on these dudes, and the cops would have took one look at me and one look at them, and I would have been the one who would have got put in cuffs. But to answer your question in short, no, I don't feel like a coward based on what other people do. It's all about how I react to it and what the end results are. So Jose Moreno wants to know, out of the 14 bonds, what do you feel is the most one broken? I'm going to say bond 4. This is bond 4. In order to continue our struggle with far less difficulties, there shall be no tolerance created by internal confrontation, individualism, or homeboy favoritism. No norteño will spread false rumors or gossip about a fellow norteño, and at no time will a norteño attempt to take advantage of or disrespect a fellow norteño's ruca or familia. To do so will result in serious repercussions. This by far is the most broken bond amongst the 14 NR bonds. Norteños are always disrespecting each other. They're always trying to tear each other down, and there is no respect for familia, wives, or rucas. When I became an NR member back in the late 80s, these things had profound meanings. We looked at each other's familia as the purest forms of reflection that existed, and you could trust a fellow norteño to go by your crib and drop something off. Nowadays, it's not like that. You can't trust anyone anymore. Now you gotta worry about them trying to get at your girl and gorilla macking on you. And we used to defend each other's honor when someone would attempt to spread some negative gossip or false propaganda. Now, instead of checking someone and telling them that we don't get on like that and that they're in violation for gossiping, they'll either feed into it or say nothing at all. So there is no more honor. Even the tail end of this bond is no longer enforced. There is no serious repercussions. Nowadays, these guys are quicker to tell you how dirty your girl is for opening up her legs than they are about holding someone accountable. So Gatecrasher wants to know, is it possible to navigate through the California prison system without being affiliated to a prison gang? I guess anything's possible, but I think it would be hard. If you're someone who didn't grow up in the hood and you weren't known for banging out there, then you might be able to slide through playing another or Christian. In that scenario, it might be possible. But if you grew up in the hood and you've got homies that know you, then I think you might have problems. So Charlie Lokes wants to know, can you touch on the norteños that got busted in Salt Lake City, Utah? You can find online. Proves the point when you said they expanded all over the country. I run a segment on the norteño stronghold out there in Utah. But other than that, there's not much to expand on right here. Those norteños in Utah are tied into the federal NF branch. They managed to recruit one guy from Utah that had a lot of influence out there in Utah, and he became a conduit that helped them build. These same kind of norteño establishments and strongholds are now popping up all over the country. But like I said, I'll run a spill on the Utah faction soon. I'm going to try to locate it, but if there's a picture inserted in this paragraph, it's going to be of an NF member from Utah that's responsible for a lot of the broken ground out there and most of the recruitment. The picture's a bad pic. And there is a picture. That's the guy above with the black t-shirt. Or the black white beater. So Bird Doe wants to know, did you get remarried and have plans to have kids? You're a good speaker. You ever thought about working with at-risk youth? or any offers to speak? To answer the first part of your question, yes, I did get remarried after losing my last wife to lupus. And the one thing I will say about my wife is this: she's definitely been able to restore the happiness and a lot of the voids that I thought I lost with my last wife. That's something I thought I'd never find again. Honestly, after losing my wife to lupus, I never thought I'd get involved in any more relationships. But then I unexpectedly ended up meeting her. She's also been an important and integral part of me maintaining my freedom and sobriety. And for me, that's priceless. As far as kids, I'm open to it, so if it happens, then this would just be another blessing. With regards to working with at-risk youth or speaking offers, yes, I've worked with some at-risk youth and there's been a lot of offers to speak. I'm open to it, but right now I'm concentrating on finishing up my second book and continuing to provide content for YouTube. So Santino Lopez wants to know, did you cover up all your Nuestra Familia related tattoos or just the one on the back of your head? What was your basis behind it? Also, did you know Flaco and Rojo when you and them were active? Yes, I've been knowing Flaco and Rojo for years now. Both of them were under me at different times. I met Rojo when he was like 19, 20 years old, maybe even younger than that. He might even have been 18. He was just a little bony kid, man. I actually ended up bringing him into this lifestyle. Flaco was under me when I was running the street regiment in San Jose, so I have extensive history with both of these guys. As far as my tattoos, yes, I covered up the tattoo on the back of my head a couple years ago. I already elaborated on this in one of my previous questions, but my basis was to avoid being the recipient of that kind of negative attention. Because of the circumstances, I just don't think it does anything beneficial for me to continue walking around advertising the Nuestra Familia on the back of my head. My goal is to stay low-key, to stay flying under the radar. So that's why I went through the trouble of having it covered up. So Cesar Castellanos wants to know, if you could go back in time and say something to 12-year-old boxer, what would you say to him? And a lot of these questions have a lot of the same parallels, as I think I've already answered something along these lines, so I'm just going to keep this one simple. I tell that little badass mofo to keep his ass in school, to stay away from gangs, and to leave drugs alone. Those are the three negatives that threw my life in a bad direction, so I'd obviously say or do whatever I could to make sure he didn't fall into that same pattern. So Nicholas A wants to know, do you know of any NF members that are Puerto Rican or who were born on the East Coast and moved to California and became NF members? I'm just curious to know if the NF had Puerto Ricans in it. Yes, matter of fact, there's one named Eddie Colon Manzanas from New York. He was involved with that hit on Cheyenne. After he got out of prison, when he paroled, he ended up moving back to New York. So he's out there on the East Coast somewhere, if he's still alive. So there's been a lot of Puerto Ricans and other ethnicities who became NF members, but the most prominent one that always comes to mind when I think about Puerto Ricans is Robert Babo Sosa from Santa Barbara. At one time, Babo was the Nuestro General who single-handedly ran the entire organization himself. He had lieutenants under him who acted as advisors like Death Row Joe Gonzalez. But at one time, Babo was the leader who ran the entire organization by himself until he was later impeached for misappropriation of organizational funds and for no longer working for the best interest of the organization. Because of what the organization learned from Babo's tenure, the Mesa was created as it was decided that giving one lone member this much authority actually opened the door for corruption and that it would be better to create a council. Thus, the Mesa was born. So Don Miguel Gonzalez wants to know, I watched the profile you did on Crazy Rudy, M.A., and how he was schooling the youngsters and the approach he was taking with these individuals. Did you have individuals approach you the same way with respect besides your mentor as you were becoming more involved with the O? Any individuals during your time that really stood out the way they schooled and approached the younger Norteños? Yeah, Rudy did have a unique way of mentoring those youngsters in that video, and that's why I shared that video with you guys. Different C's have different styles for mentoring and indoctrinating the younger guys, but the one thing they all have in common is that they're all articulate, they all know how to influence, and they all lead by example. Those are good leaders. Throughout my career, yes, I had a lot of youngsters approach me in the same way, and I never turned any one of them away. I always took education serious, and I never missed an opportunity to instill some of my beliefs in these guys. As far as individuals who stood out to me during the time when I was getting groomed myself, Mike MC Castillo from Salinas, Robert Chico Rose from Salinas, Sheldon Skip Villanueva from San Jose, and Timothy Timo Hernandez from San Jose were just a few of the C's who stood out and inspired me. I was impressed by not only their verbals, but by also how committed they all appeared to be, and that's something that always stuck with me. So Eddie Garcia wants to know, the NF back in the day started off by Raza from Southern Cal. Why most of those members either drop out or got a green light placed on them? Was it mistrust because they were from Southern California? The shift in where these C's originated from, or the geographical shift in where C's were recruited from, had nothing to do at all with geography. You are absolutely correct. Back in the 60s and 70s, there were no geographical lines. This all came later. But when all this changed, it's not like there was some big push to purge or extract the C's who were all Southern California based. Those C's remained with the organization until their beliefs changed or until they decided that this lifestyle wasn't for them anymore. That's why there's still a couple C's from SoCal that are still active and who still remain NF members to this day. Joseph Pinky Hernandez is from Rancho Cucamonga, and David DC Cervantes is from Chino. In fact, Marcus Tarzan Castaneda, an NF member from Pomona, was still active with the NF up until a few months ago, until he died in federal prison. So no, it had nothing to do with anything like mistrust or not liking them because they were from SoCal. None of that is relevant. The only thing that matters is what they believe in. So Javier Wagen wants to know, or states, every PC or dropout always say that SNY yards are worse than GP yards. They only say that so they don't feel like penochas for going to an SNY yard. How can SNY yards be worse if all those fools went over there because they couldn't hang on a GP yard? Let me spit some intelligence at you, man, because it has nothing to do with them being penochas, okay? Explain something. I couldn't wait to respond to this question because you're either somebody who's either never been to prison and don't understand what's really involved, or you just have a real cynical way of looking at things. First of all, I've never been to an SNY. I'll never go to an SNY, and I could honestly care one way or the other if people consider those yards soft or hard. It just don't matter to me. And it wouldn't benefit me or affect me one way or the other to hype it up or make those yards sound like they're tough places to be. From your comment, it sounds like you seem to think that some of those guys that have been there or who have been there claim that these yards are tough environments as some type of way for them to save face or something. In fact, it's not those guys that are saying that. It's actually the guys who have been victimized that are claiming this. But it's not about that, and you're missing the whole point. The best way to explain it to you is like this. What makes the SNY a more violent and tougher environment to be in is because of how the yards are ran and because of how the politics are played. On a general population yard where you have active functioning norteños, sureños, NF, MA, ABs, and BGF members, these gangs are tightly controlled and order is maintained through rigid structures of leadership. There is no renegades. Everybody functions according to protocol. And there's just a lot of things that you can't do or you run the risk of getting whacked yourself. When you're active, renegades are considered as threats because they don't follow protocol and they do what they want. That's why they're removed as soon as they reveal themselves. Renegades who operate individually have the potential of starting a full-scale war, so that's one of the reasons why they're considered to be threats. Now, imagine going from a structured, fully functioning active yard to a yard with nothing but renegades. Dudes that do what they want, when they want, and how they want. Anything is fair game, including taking advantage of the weak and vulnerable. There is no rules of engagement out there, and this is what makes it so dangerous. Protocol, rules, regulations, and policies are all out the window. On an active yard, if a Norteño disrespects another homeboy and this same individual just goes around disrespecting people at will, the homies will lay this dude down. He's not going to be allowed to move like that out there. You basically have the gang to protect you. On an S&Y yard, this is regular program. This is how some of these dudes conduct themselves on a regular basis because they know that no one's going to do nothing about it. You don't have a gang out there to protect you. You're forced to stand on your own 2 feet as a man and deal with it yourself. That is, unless you decide to get reaffiliated with one of them dropout gangs out there. So that's why it's so dangerous. The other thing is this. If you're one of those guys that think everyone out there on an S&Y is a pussy because they're no longer active or because they might have shown an act of cowardice, you better think again. I understand the active belief system. I held it down for almost 40 years. We tend to think that these guys that dropped out are trash, degenerates, and weak mofos who sold out and turned their backs. I get it. Nobody wants to give trash any credit, and you want to reduce them all the way down to nothing. Some of that might apply, but don't get it misconstrued. That killer mentality, or that same mentality that the gang seen and recruited them for in the first place, just doesn't disappear and go away. Like they say, you can take a gang member out of the gang, but you can't take the gang mentality out of a gang member. The same is true for what made that individual dangerous in the first place. Some of these DOs are more treacherous than some of these active dudes. And most of the older guys that have been around and who ain't speaking out of pride will tell you this themselves. You gotta always remember that these guys still carry that knowledge and that all these things that were instilled within them. To each his own, but I think anyone who writes those guys off, whether you think they're degenerates or not, is a serious misconception and a bad miscalculation that could only be detrimental to you in the long run. Never underestimate or write anyone off, no matter what they've done, because as long as they have 2 arms and 2 legs, they're still capable of running something through you. This concludes this Q&A. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. I know that this has been a slow 2 weeks as far as getting you guys content, but we're going to put some overtime in to make up for what we've missed. Also on the chapters, some of you have spoken insofar as the short chapters and there not being enough. We're also going to improve this as well, as we'll try to get at least one 30-minute chapter or 30 minutes worth of chapters out of each book each day. We try our best to accommodate you guys where we can, but sometimes we get backed up or caught up in things as well. Thank you all for the support. We'll also be dropping something on the federal stuff as well. Nothing repetitive of what you've already heard. New stuff with pics, so be looking for this as well. We're working on getting new pics of all the defendants in the new federal indictment that just recently happened. But here's just a couple for now. Esteban, Trino, and Gangster. Also, this week we're going to be beefing up our Patreon. So those of you that have been waiting for new content, it's coming this week.